In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Bungubox Armor Black. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion.
From a wet broad pen, I see a lot of shading with this ink, which is not my preference at all. I do recognize that it is showing to be reminiscent of old leather armor that's been dyed black, and with that I do think it's doing a very good job. It definitely does. When I think of like my black leather boots and how they've worn, some of these tones I am absolutely seeing in my leather boots. I believe you'd see it in leather armor, so it's doing that very well. It looks correct. It's just not my black ink. I want my black ink to be very solid, very dark, which this isn't all the time. It can be, just isn't all the time. Don't use this ink for that solid black because you're really getting that leather armor look, those tones. Now, you can get from the right pen, which I'll do at the end, a nice dark black, but I can definitely say that I'm very happy I used it, but I don't feel any need to have a bottle of this ink.
I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Jinhao X450 with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we see it is a nice dark black tone. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. I kind of do wish it was a little bit darker of a black. It is a very nice black. I would just like it to be a little bit darker from this fine nib. Looking at the zoom nib, we see that it is looking around the same tones in its dark tones as we got from the fine, but we're seeing a lot of gray going on in this. So it has no feather, it has no spread, it is shading, and we're seeing this gray to black shading going on quite a bit, which again, it fits what goes on with the armor look, but not necessarily for me. I'm not particularly good with a zoom nib. Looking at this music nib, which I tend to be better writing with, it has no feather, it has no spread, its tones are the same tones that we got in the zoom, which gives us the same problems we had in the zoom, that this is shading. I don't see it really as a problem for the ink, it's a problem for me with black ink, that it does shade very well. If you like that out of your black inks, it's doing a great job of it. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very minor ghosting, if any, and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib. A Sailor 1911 Large with a zoom nib. A Sailor 1911 Standard with a music nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we see that this is a very dark gray in what's going on. The paper's a bit more absorbent. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread. We are getting a little bit of shading that's going on, which, you know, if that's what you're after here, that's great. I can live with this here, but this is not the black ink that I personally would go for. Looking at the zoom nib, it's showing some of the problems for this paper. It does feather quite frequently, very small, all over the place. There's a tiny bit of spread, but that's a little harder to notice only because a zoom nib has such variation in what it can do writing that saying it spreads is also sometimes identifying different angles you're writing at. It is showing a little bit of shading, not nearly as much as the fine did, but there's small points of it there. Not too bad. I guess it's okay, but probably never use a zoom on this type of notebook outside of reviews. The music nib has feathers, has spread, has shading, all not things that we're particularly looking for or happy with on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there is a lot of coming deep into the page, but not through the page, not touching the page underneath. You just cannot use the back of the page. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get really, there's tiny feathers. You can hunt them down. You can zoom way in and see it, but to the eye in general, it's doing very well, and it's not bad at all here. There's no spread, there's no shading whatsoever. I think the tone of the paper really takes the shading out of this. I think it looks darker here than it did on the Clairfontaine paper, which is a very nice thing. Looking at the zoom nib, it feathers like mad, but it's a very wet paper, or a very wet pen on a more absorbent paper, so that's bound to happen. It does spread. This would be, if I had a whole ton of writing like this would possibly work towards unrecoverable for me. I don't like it. Looking at the music nib, it's got less feathering than the zoom. It does have a tiny bit of spread. It doesn't show any kind of shading. Now, the feathering that's going on is very consistent all over it, almost to the point of giving it a slightly blurry look. Looking at the page underneath, you see I circled 3 little spots where it did touch the page underneath with the zoom nib, which is the wettest that was there. Seeing the back of the page, it is immediately obvious in how much ghosting is going on and why there is bleed through. However, the Fine did a really good job, and you can probably use the back of the page.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook.
Looking at the Fine nib, it is doing really well here. Now, it's not as dark as I would prefer. It is like a lighter black or a very dark gray, but I would consider this rather acceptable for what's going on here, even though this would be an expensive ink to deal with for this. The Fine has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It's generally very good. I'm not sure. There's something that feels just like not quite there for this, but I do think its performance is pretty good. Looking at the zoom nib, you're going to see a lot of tiny feathering all over it. You are going to see some spread going on, more having to do with the paper and a very wet pen combined together. You do see some shading coming through, and I don't get it. I'm actually very surprised, being that it's more absorbent and the shading is there. Shocker. Looking at the music nib, you see there's tiny feathering the entire way through. Almost, not quite to the point of looking a little blurry, but on some words it can. On the first word in, it does look a little blurry. Only in certain parts of September does it get blurry. I think that's the weather and allergies. No shading at all. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing that bled through and touched the next page, so no problems there. You do see some ghosting, but it is very manageable. You could probably use this if you wanted to.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Johann Sebastian Bach Black. Here is Noodler's Black. Here is Private Reserve Invincible Black. Here is Wancher Original Tomoku Black. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook.
Looking at the Fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading, a darker black than we've gotten on a couple of the other papers that were also inexpensively produced. This is looking pretty good here. But again, I'm going to come back on the idea of spending this kind of money on this ink and then putting it on the cheapest paper you can find, for me, seems a little off. Looking at the zoom nib, we get a lot of feather. We're going to get a lot of spread. We're not going to get any shading. It is going to be, without a doubt, the darkest tone of this that we really get out of that zoom nib, being how wet it really is. Looking at the music nib, we get a lot less feathering than we got with the zoom. There's a tiny bit here and there, but I can live with what's happening. We're not really getting spread. we're not really getting any shading. I say not really because if you look on the top line, the word port does look a little lighter on the left side than it does on the right side. The T looks darker than the rest of the word. But I'm going to give this one a go on that and say it's doing much better than really I expect on this paper. This paper has impressed me a few times. Looking at the back of the page, you do see that it ghosts. I think you could use the back of the page. It definitely does not bleed through at all. Outstanding for the paper. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Camlin Scarlet Red. Here is KWZ Green Gold. Here is Pilot Morning Glory. Here is Robert Oster Torquay. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get tiny feathers, really the tiniest of feathers, barely worth mentioning, only mentioning because it pretty much always happens on this paper, but this is truly outstanding performance for what this paper is. This ink does especially well. There's no spread, there's no shading. It's a nice dark black tone, so if you write on this all the time, this ink could be very worthwhile to you. Looking at the zoom nib, like we would expect, there's a ton of feathering, there's a ton of spread, there is no shading, it looks gross, it looks blurry. Let's move on. Looking at the music nib, there is feathering, but there's less feather than we got in the zoom. There's not as much spread. I think it's doing fairly well. There is some spread, but really very manageable to me. There's no real shading. I think it's doing okay. I don't like how this looks on this paper, but I think it's performing okay. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing that bled through and touched the page underneath. Even though there's a ton of spots that look like it would, it didn't. We do get a massive amount of show through. You can't use the back of the page, but we generally don't expect to be able to use the back of the page with this paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? So when looking at this ink, it shades from broader nibs even when they're wet, which is not for me, but doesn't necessarily mean that that's bad. If you like how this is looking from the zoom and from the music, then you have a really good idea of how it's going to look from your broads or your stubs. If you love it, this is a great way to go. But that's not for me. For me, I want the dark, solid black line. And for that, I want to use a wet fine or medium nib. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.